Neurodiversity is really important. It's just a natural variation of the human genome. We're looking at autism, we're looking at ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. It's just a different brain type. And for me, the challenges lie not necessarily in neurodiversity itself, but in the fact that you have to fit into the box of neurotypicals, right? That's the challenge.
Welcome to Your Second Act, the podcast that proves that life doesn't have to end at 40, 50, or even 60, because when it comes to living your best life, age is just a number. Hey guys, it's Michelle here, your host, and welcome to Your Second Act. And if you are new to the show, welcome. I am so excited that you're here and that you found my show. Now, have you guys noticed lately there's been so much talk about midlife and ADHD, and I've actually found myself asking the question, could I have this? I seem to tick a lot of the boxes when they talk about the symptoms. And I know many women are starting to question this as well as they navigate the changes of midlife. Is it just menopause, brain fog, or could there be something more? It's a topic I've been really curious about, especially after hearing stories from friends who've recently been diagnosed. So, in today's episode, we're going to dive in deep into ADHD and midlife and why more women are being diagnosed with it and what the journey looks like. I'm joined today by Leanne, who is a women's psychologist who specializes in working with midlife women, including those dealing with ADHD and neurodiversity. So if you've ever wondered if your brain fog could be something more, or if you know of someone who might need to hear this conversation, please share this episode with them. It might be the insight that they've been looking for all along. So let's just get straight into my episode with Leanne. Hey, Leanne, welcome to the podcast. I'm very excited to have you here.
Thanks so much. Very happy to be here.
Yeah. Now, ADHD and menopause, it feels like it's the new black. There are so many people talking about it, and I think we're finally seeing more open and honest conversations in regards to it, which I think is great. And especially when it comes to neurodiversity, I think the stigma connected to it is definitely lifting, which I think is really encouraging. So it just got me thinking, because so many people are talking about it and so many people are very open about, like, I have this, and, they're willing to be open to talk about it. So I thought, well, why don't I bring on an expert like yourself to discuss, why do you think there has been this shift in so many menopausal midlife women being diagnosed with ADHD?
I think it's awareness. I mean, I have a lot of ladies that I work with come in and they're embarrassed almost to be here, and they're sort of saying, "Oh, I've seen this on TikTok, or I don't want, maybe it's not. I'm not sure." But I think it's just awareness. I think with the rise of social media and things like TikTok, people putting symptoms up there and women reading through and going, "Oh my God, that's me." So I think awareness is a massive part of it. I also think that obviously at midlife we have that big uptick in diagnosis, and I think that's due a lot to women having their kids assessed, and they're sort of filling in the forms, the questionnaires, and they're like, "Oh my God, that's me." And the other part is obviously the whole midlife transition and how impactful that is in terms of, hormone fluctuations affecting every other part of our life. That resilience to stress that women might have had before, and those coping strategies that they use just don't work anymore. So it kind of hits them in the head with the executive functioning challenges.
Yeah, because I noticed with a couple of my friends, they were diagnosed because their children were diagnosed with it. So I think there's definitely that connection. But and a lot of people, yeah, who have ADHD will say, I'm just so tired of masking it. And then when they get the diagnosis, it's like, wow, okay, I now better understand who I am, which I think that also works hand in hand with midlife. It's like you really want to work out who you are, and then getting this diagnosis, it's like it's a weight that's been lifted. So yeah, for me personally, I even want to understand more about it, and how you go about getting the diagnosis and then dealing with the fact that you do have it, and how how does it change your life? What do you need to do to accept it? And also, people around you and your family and your friends. I mean, a lot of people aren't educated when it comes to ADHD. So, yeah, like what's your advice with that from the starting point of diagnosis?
Absolutely. Midlife is such a reckoning. It's time. I describe it as, for some women, it's like a speed hump. For other women, it's like a brick wall and walking straight into it. But it's a time when you kind of you think about how you've managed up until now, and is that really the way I want to move on with the next phase of my life? So in that reckoning, it's like, okay, what? How did I get here? Is it mostly survival? Was I masking all this time? And there is, as I said, the resilience to stress and the cognitive challenges that come with midlife and menopause really look a lot like ADHD. Some of the brain fog and the difficulty concentrating and the attention challenges are all very similar to the executive challenges with ADHD. So I think for women that have been masking, menopause is just the end. There's just no capacity left to mask anymore. These women have kind of been in survival mode their whole life. They've been so stressed and having that chronic stress response all the time in order to fit in, because women are so relational and they internalize everything and everything's their fault. So I think that brick wall that I spoke about is a time when they really consider, what have I been doing and how do I want to move forward, or just basically can't function anymore like they used to. So for a lot of women, it shows up in midlife, as we said. So the start of diagnosis is thinking about when these challenges started. So ADHD is a neurodevelopmental condition. So the symptoms when we're looking at diagnosis, we're really looking for symptoms before the age of 12. And again, women are great maskers. So sometimes it's really challenging to find those evidence of those symptoms. Unfortunately, our diagnostic criteria is written for male white boys.
Of course.
Yeah, and it's a lot of, that hyperactive presentation.
Yes.
Boys and men generally tend to externalize, women and girls internalize. So it's really quite challenging to find that evidence. It's often reading between the lines in reports and seeing comments like, she's got great potential but can't live up to it, or often handing in reports late, or she's a chatterbox, or she's zoning out and daydreaming. So it is challenging to find that evidence. I think that's the main issue I have doing assessments, is coming up with that evidence, because the symptoms that you experience, as I said, in menopause are very similar to ADHD, executive functioning challenges, but we really need to see that being an issue in childhood as well. So that's where I'd start. I'd start to think about, if you're experiencing it in midlife, was this really something that I've struggled with all my life?
Right. So, what I did was I went out to my community and said, have you got any questions for Leanne? Especially if
Okay.
you know someone who has ADHD, you want to understand more, or have you been diagnosed with it? So, some of the questions that I received were actually quite interesting and things that I didn't even think about. So, this one woman said, I'm over 50. Taking medication for ADHD has been life changing. However, I have concerns on the long term effects on my heart. Should I be taking medication every day?
Yeah, that's a great question. And with the more studies we have on ADHD, we have noted that there can be some impacts to cardiovascular functioning. However, sometimes the cardiovascular concerns need to be balanced with the benefits that you're experiencing. Now, I'm not a medical doctor, but with the women that I've worked with that have had experiences with this, they generally tend to see a cardiologist, and get kind of their personal cardiovascular profile. So they can also say, hey, let's try and we're going to monitor whether this has any impacts on your cardiovascular functioning. They might also work with your doctor in trying to find the lowest effective dose. So they might titrate it down a little bit or up a bit, depending on what's the sweet spot for you, and trying to get to the lowest dose possible.
So, what's your opinion on people that, because my understanding is you have the long wearing
Mhm.
medication and then you have the short wearing. So,
Yep.
what happens if you don't take it every day? Does it affect you negatively because you don't?
Great question. Yeah, we used to think that, just take it when you need it, sort of have it if you've got a test coming up, or have it if you've got a
Yeah.
really hard work day. The evidence is mixed, and for some people that works really well. Some people don't need to take it every day. But we do sometimes see issues with sort of it impacting you differently if you're not taking it every day. So we see, okay, it's taking me a while to get used to it again, or it's having other side effects. So it really depends on the individual. Some people can manage it okay and only have it acting when they've really got to get something done. And other people prefer to have it every day and just kind of get into that cycle. Some people have it every day and then have the weekends off. It really does. It's trial and error, unfortunately. Yeah. And there's other non stimulant medication options available too if a heart condition is something you're worried about. But I think it's a really individual
Yeah,
approach.
sounds like it. Okay.
Mm.
Another question. I feel drained and overwhelmed when socializing.
Mhm.
Sometimes
Yeah.
I zone out to cope and then I miss crucial parts of the conversation. Do you have any tips on how to not disassociate in social settings? I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, well, I guess if you consider what a conversation looks like, right? There's lots of information coming at you, and I probably should have said this at the start. ADHD, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, is one of the most poorly named conditions that exist because it's not a deficit of attention; it's a difficulty regulating your attention. So
Right.
it's not like you're not concentrating because you don't have enough attention. You're not concentrating because you are seeing and hearing everything. I can hear the birds outside. I can see movement over there. And it's a difficulty zoning in on what's happening in front of you or what you're supposed to be concentrating on.
Right.
So it's a regulation issue, not necessarily a deficit in attention. In terms of the social interaction, when you're having a conversation, there's so much going on that you probably don't even consider. So it's filtering out all that other sensory input, sustaining attention in what we're talking about, and then executive functioning, thinking about what you're going to say next or trying to remember what the person's talking about. So that zoning out experience happens quite a lot and can be a combination of all those difficulties. And while that's happening, you're really nervous and probably quite stressed. So making sure that you're doing everything you're supposed to be doing. So they kind of all collide and kind of you tend to zone out and disassociate a bit.
So, what tips would you give to someone who's feeling that?
I think it's called social pacing. So it's like trying to perhaps instead of meeting for a lunch or a dinner that is going to be a longer period of time, offering to catch up for coffee or something like that so you can limit it and maybe even say, I've got an appointment in half an hour. So you know that there's a limited time that you have to be doing it for. If it's becoming overwhelming, you can duck out to the loo and have 5 minutes in there to kind of down regulate again. Trying to ground yourself is really important. So noticing the ground underneath your feet, things you might notice that get you out of your head and get you back into the moment. I think being strategic about if you are using medication, when is the optimal time the dose is going to kind of kick in, can be really helpful too. Connecting with a friend, a trusted friend that might know about the ADHD that you can kind of let know and you can have a signal if it's becoming too much for you, or they'll be able to repeat things and help you stay focused. They're all sort
Oh,
of tips.
okay. Yeah, that's good coping mechanism. It's probably even worthwhile your family learning that as well, because then they can support you. Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? You don't what someone who hasn't got that takes that for granted that you're just in a social setting, you don't think about it. But yeah, I it's these questions have really opened my eyes to what people must be going through on something that I might find that's just, it doesn't bother me on a day-to-day basis. So another question which I thought was interesting, why is it so expensive to be diagnosed with ADHD with lots of exams that you have to put yourself through and then it's also the medication side of things. Like what's your take on it?
Yeah, I agree. I wish it weren't because sometimes that excludes a big part of the population that
Yeah.
can't get access, yeah, to the just even the realization that this is something that's affecting me because ADHD can be so invalidating. A lot of people internalize it as there's something wrong with me, my character, or I'm not trying hard enough, or I mustn't care enough. So for people not to have access to that idea that, okay, it's ADHD, that explains so much of my life. It's really impactful. It's a really pivotal moment in a lot of people's lives. So in terms of the expense, look, some of it is commercialization, some of it shouldn't be as expensive as it is, but it is a really time. It really takes a long time. So for me, when I'm doing a diagnosis, I've got to exclude a lot of things. So there's a lot of other conditions that look like ADHD. So, it's almost like a process of exclusion. So I'm making sure, it's not trauma or it's not, a brain injury or there's not, other lists of things that it could be. I mean, things can happen at the same time, but it's about teasing apart if there is ADHD there. So you've got to do lots of standardized measures, so lots of questionnaires. You've got to connect with someone from their childhood that knew them then, so you can ascertain those symptoms in childhood. So it does take quite a long time. It's a lot bigger, more comprehensive process than I think a lot of people understand.
And do you have to initially see a psychiatrist to get the diagnosis?
No. So a psychologist or a psychiatrist can diagnose ADHD. You tend to get a much more comprehensive kind of report from a psychologist. And what generally happens a lot of the time is someone will take the psychologist report to the psychiatrist and they then either confirm their diagnosis and sort of say, yeah, I agree. And here's the medication. So a lot of people don't involve the psychiatrist unless they want medication. That's the gateway to the medication because for now, only a psychiatrist, if you're an adult, can prescribe the medication.
Because it's highly regulated, isn't it?
So highly regulated. And there's talk about whether it needs to be.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's talk about GPs being able uh, to prescribe. That hasn't happened yet. Certainly not in New South Wales, but there's talk about it. We'll see. For now, it's only psychiatrists.
Yeah, because I think it's quite interesting when let's say you're feeling anxious and you go to your GP. They are so quick to write you a script for an antidepressant. And I think, well, why is it so damn hard then to get a script for Ritalin or Vyvanse or whatever it is? Yeah, I wonder if that's going to change in the future because you think about the rise in diagnosis that you think that it'd have to be, say, less regulated in that sense. Because I know through a lot of people, especially kids that have sort of entered their early adulthood, then all of a sudden they have to start the process again. And it's really hard. And that's where you see, unfortunately, you see a lot of kids saying, hey, so and so has it. I'm going to get some of my medication from that person. And, that can cause a whole set of issues, can't it?
Yeah, look, it is important that you get individual help, often because, you usually start on a really low dose to see if there's any side effects or if that one's working for you. It's all different types. So we want to make sure that starting at a really low dose. And then if that's working, there's no negative side effects to just titrate that up and increase that slowly. So it is important that you do see a specialist and they're looking at, you mentioned the cardiovascular issues. They want to make sure they're having a good look at
Yeah.
is this right for you and does this suit you? But I agree, I think in an ideal world, it would be great if, a psychologist could diagnose and a GP could prescribe because that would make it so much easier because there's so many more GPs and psychiatrists and so much cheaper. But for now, the psychiatrist or the pediatrician, if you're a child, are involved in the prescribing of the medication.
Another question, which is something that you deal a lot in, is prior to
Mhm.
going into menopause, I was diagnosed with PMDD, which I want you to explain what that is. What's the
Mm.
link between ADHD and PMDD? Antidepressants were prescribed for my PMDD. Would ADHD medication have been better for my PMDD? So, can we start with the PMDD?
So PMDD stands for premenstrual dysphoric disorder. So premenstrual meaning before your period, and dysphoria is the opposite of euphoria. So it's that low mood, irritability, rage. Sometimes there's physical pain as well. Women often describe being like Jekyll and Hyde. So they're sort of themselves for most of their cycle, but in that luteal phase, that kind of week or so before your period, turn into a monster. Things that didn't bother them before send them into a rage. It's a very impactful condition. It can impact relationship, work. And I work with a lot of women who haven't taken promotions because they can't handle that phase. They know they won't be able to handle that phase in their job during that cycle. So it's so impactful. We think about a third of women either consider or engage in suicidal activities that have this because it's so destabilizing. Half your cycle, so three quarters of your cycle, you're yourself,
Yeah.
and then the other time you just your functioning decreases so rapidly. So it's a really impactful condition.
And so what is the link then between ADHD and PMDD?
Yeah, I know this is going to surprise you, Michelle, but we don't have much research. I know it's a shocking thing to not have research in women's health, but
Right.
what we do know is that both are a dysregulation of neurotransmitters. So we're looking at serotonin, dopamine, and norepinephrine. So both of those are dysregulated. PMDD is a hormonal sensitivity. So the hormones aren't different. It's their brain that's more sensitive to the changes in hormones. So we think that with ADHD, there's also that sensitivity. So there's a crossover. And yes, you're right. Women with PMDD are more likely to have ADHD.
Okay, that's
Mm.
interesting. So, do you think if someone, I'm assuming this person who has ADHD and PMDD is taking antidepressants, do
Yeah.
you think that that person could come off the antidepressants and just take medication for ADHD? Or do you think, I mean, I guess, I don't know, is that hard for you to answer?
Yeah, again, not a medical doctor, but with the women that I've worked with, it doesn't need to be an either or. So some women use SSRIs or antidepressants to manage that fluctuation. Some women use a contraceptive pill because that stops ovulation, so that can help with that change in hormone levels. Some women have seen great success with using ADHD medication, and they find that they can zone in, and it's gotten rid of all the other overwhelm because they're suddenly able to focus in. So I don't think it needs to be either or. I think all of them can be helpful. Some women only use the medication during their cycle or the antidepressants when they're having that
Ah,
PMDD. So, yeah, it's one of the only conditions where you can kind of cycle dose.
yeah.
But we do have evidence that for women with ADHD, their cycle impacts their symptoms. So in that luteal phase after ovulation, that second period or the week before your period, that they do notice their symptoms are worse. And that's because of that fluctuation in estrogen, which, impacts their ability to concentrate, it impacts their mood, and impacts their resilience. So we do know that much.
So, what I'm hearing is the medication is one part of it, but
Mhm.
psychologically you have the other side. How do you cope? How do you bring the two together? So,
Mm.
I mean, can you give us an example of how you've seen someone who's turned up to your clinic and then has started some therapy with you and how it's changed them?
So, in terms of PMDD, obviously, the medication does help, but women do struggle a lot. So, a lot of what I do in the PMDD space is being able to helping them manage that emotion regulation, helping them tolerate the distress, helping them stop from going 0 to 100 without thinking about how they got there. Some of it's about accepting the condition and recognizing that that's a challenge that they face, but also living a life aligned to their values. So they're the sort of PMDD stuff. With the ADHD, it's a lot of coaching in terms of strategies they can use to help process tasks that neurotypical people ask of them. So it might be chunking up tasks to make them smaller, just sort of practical strategies. For women that get a later diagnosis, there can be a lot of shame and a lot of grief involved in the
Mm,
diagnosis. For a lot of them, they struggle with the fact of how their lives might have been different if they had have had the scaffolding and the support and were
mm,
able to be kind of authentically cared for as kids, before they'd had to go through all these challenges of masking throughout their whole life because it's just exhausting
for
and really
sure.
invalidating. And for them, provokes a lot of shame, which they've usually internalized. So, it's a bit of a gamut of all different things, but, I cannot stress enough how life-changing diagnosis can be. Not in terms of a label being helpful, but in terms of them being able to understand more about themselves and understand maybe things that have happened in the past.
I have a friend who feels that in her workplace, she would never actually admit to having ADHD because she feels, I don't know if she feels shame connected to it, but she feels the judgment. And because she works in a smaller environment, she said there is no way that I could actually say, look, when you get frustrated with me because my recall isn't as good as yours, it's because of this. And she feels very uncomfortable. And she said, can you please ask her what are the benefits of actually having ADHD?
That's a great question. So I kind of, when I'm talking to women and talking about ADHD, and it might be something they haven't really thought about, I kind of liken neurodiversity to like biodiversity. When we're looking at ecosystems all across the planet, it's really vital that there's diversity. Otherwise,
Yeah.
they wither and die, and they're not the most they don't thrive. And I think it's the same in social components in human populations. Neurodiversity is really important. It's just a natural variation of the human genome. So, we're looking at autism, we're looking at ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia. It's just a different brain type. And for me, the challenges lie not necessarily in neurodiversity itself, but in the fact that you have to fit into the box of neurotypicals, right? That's the
Yes.
challenge.
Yeah.
I like to think, oh, is there a parallel universe where it's just neurodiversity is dominant, and how do the neurotypicals?
Yeah.
Wouldn't that be an interesting experiment? Like,
Yeah.
how are the neurotypicals going? But yeah, in terms of strengths, I think divergent thinking, there's so many innovative things that have happened in our everyday life that wouldn't be there without ADHD is, without neurodiversity. I don't know about your friend, you might have noticed, but crisis management, excellent in a crisis. The dopamine and the norepinephrine, the stress kind of come up to another, they just zone in and they're just really great in a crisis. Lots of ADHDs are really creative. Um, they've kind of got cognitive flexibility, so they can flip and change a little bit more than the neurotypicals. Pattern recognition, seeing patterns in things. Neurodiverse people, ADHDers, have really great empathy and resilience because they have had to survive in a neurotypical world. So they've usually got a lot of empathy for other people as well.
Mm.
There's loads of strengths. I don't want to diminish the challenges because they exist,
Yes.
but I think challenges exist in trying to live in a neurotypical world.
My hope is for the future, and the future of, I guess, the younger generation, that they're really putting in place in schools programs that can support neurodiverse children. Because the last thing you need, especially with our generation, that we feel that there's something wrong with us. And I think, and I look back at my childhood, and I used to think, oh my God, there's something wrong with me because I'm not like that person. And look, I've never been diagnosed with ADHD. I've never gone down that path. But sometimes I think, yep, I relate to a lot of it. But I just think about the little Michelle back at school all those years ago and think, wow, if maybe someone had looked at me back then, they might have thought, well, she probably is. And therefore I could have thrived throughout that time. So I'm really hoping that
Yeah.
it's just going to continue to get better and the stigma will just go. Because, like you said, we cannot fit someone who thinks a different way into a box
Yeah.
because they're not going to thrive, are they? They will
No.
not. And it's very frustrating that society still, especially education, don't get me started on that one, still wants to put kids into that bloody box, and it really gets me so angry. I just personally, I think HSC, get rid of it. It does
Yeah.
not serve anybody. The
No,
stress
agree.
related to it. So if you're neurodiverse, how are you
Mm.
going to cope with that? How
Well,
do
exactly.
you?
And it's not real life, is it? How often do you
No.
have time? You've got so many resources and tools that you
Mm,
use. If the actual HSC exam, is not at all. And there's so many people that are, really clever, and but that stress of the test conditions, they just can't. They just can't cope. So I couldn't agree more. I think the schools are getting the message, but it's taking too long. And it's really clear for a lot of people with kids in schools. One year they're thriving, the next year they're not, and you'll see that the difference is the teacher or the way that the curriculum is being shown to them. Yeah, if you've the thing with ADHD is if it's interest based, you can hyper focus, right? So, it's kind of paradoxical because for a lot of the time you're inattentive and you can't concentrate. But if it's something you're interested in, you zone right in. And that's because it's not a deficit of attention, it's the regulation. So your brain is the ADHD brain is interest based, right? So when you find something you're interested in, whoa, that flash of dopamine, and you can really hyper focus and do that for hours, right? So, when a teacher can, particularly in primary school, can introduce it in an interest based way, then you're there, you've got them, you know? So it does depend, and hopefully it's coming in. But we do know that there's accommodations and different scaffolding available for neurodiverse individuals. And that's the kind of thing that people with the later diagnosis miss out on. And that's the tragedy of it.
No, I really hope that there is going to be a change that hopefully if I'm ever blessed with grandkids that their system is going to be completely different and we're going to be more accepting of.
I'd love to think so, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Another question which was quite interesting was about cortisol. How does cortisol levels affect people with ADHD, especially when it comes to switching off and relaxing?
Great question. So cortisol is that primary stress hormone.
Mhm.
So it's got a kind of biodirectional relationship with ADHD. So in ADHD brains, they found like a functional difference. So it does work functionally differently, but also structural differences. So there's different, the regions of the brain are different. And we see that sometimes they take longer to mature, yeah, it's up to about 3 years until, what a neurotypical brain would look like. But in terms of the stress hormone cortisol, we think that there's a different system. So baseline cortisol in our systems is different to neurodiverse. And there's a few kind of factors behind that. And one of them might be that someone who's neurodiverse is kind of chronically stressed. They're kind of always looking out for ways that they're not doing the right thing.
Yeah.
And that comes from kind of being in survival mode all that time. As humans, we want to fit in. It's really important that we fit in. Otherwise, in evolutionary terms, if we didn't fit in, we got kicked out of the tribe, we died. So we really want to fit in. And particularly women and girls, because relationships are so important and they internalize everything, they're constantly on the lookout for ways they're not fitting in. So often that leads to sort of higher levels of cortisol and being constantly kind of chronically stressed. So that takes a long time to deregulate. I have a lot of clients that talk about, we'll eat dinner and my partner will be able to sit and relax, and I'm always getting up and doing something. I can't just sit still. I can't deregulate. The way that we try and suggest ways to help with that is transition. So it might look like, instead of going from one task straight to another, have a transition. So it might look like, instead of going from work straight to home and relaxing, having a walk in between and having a transition help with that process. Sleep's also really important. So making sure that you've got good sleep hygiene. So because sleep helps regulate the cortisol. So making sure you're getting enough sleep, noticing that you're stressed or that you're still kind of walking around with your shoulders up around your ears, sort of noticing that's really important. Body-based stuff, so any form of exercise, any form of dopamine hits are really good. Mindfulness is amazing, and timing your medication if you're using medications, so that you've got time to deregulate before bed or before moving on to the next thing.
Because obviously going through menopause, sleep is
Mm.
crap. So, if you add that on top of it, yeah, that'd be really, really hard. If you can't switch off, and then you don't want to constantly rely on sleeping tablets, do you? So it's trying to find a way to, yeah, calm yourself down. And I personally find what I'm doing now is in the afternoons, if I get home from work and I try my hardest not to like get into like mum mode and whatever else, I just take myself out for a walk. And I find that is the best way to calm myself down and also allow others in the family to maybe do the stuff that I wanted to do. It's slowly getting there.
I love it.
Yeah, I was just like, no, why should I? I think as women, we're just like in automatic mode, aren't we? We get home, we do this, we do that, put the washing on. It's like, I'm really trying myself to break free of
Mm.
that. And that's like, if I remove myself from the situation, then I can't. Well, I guess I'm not allowing myself to just continue the habit of doing what I usually do. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm all for walking. I think or whatever it is that you want to do, but for me, walking is great. Being outside and yeah.
Two things there. Nature's amazing, obviously, in helping deregulate. Uh, but also while you're walking, not only are you taking that time out, but you're also doing you're doing bilateral processing while you're walking. So that is helping you process. When you're walking, you're looking around all the time to make sure you don't fall over. You might not even realize it, but that's like a bilateral stimulation, which helps you process things. So a walk is amazing. My girlfriend of mine suggested, if someone asks you to do something that takes longer than 5 minutes, say, I'll think about it, or no, but I'll think about it. So, because we, as women, we just go straight in, yeah, yeah, yep, I'll do that, I'll do that, I'll do that, I'll do that. So, in terms of, pushing back a little bit and holding sort of firm boundaries, sort of saying, I'll think about it, instead of just agreeing and then being stuck doing all these things that you didn't really need to do.
Yeah. Stop saying yes and
Stop saying
being
yes.
available to everybody.
1,000%. And no is a sentence. You don't need to give excuses. Just say no.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I know. We make it so hard for ourselves, don't we? But it's like you've got to relearn. You've got to retrain your brain for some reason when we get to this stage. Because as much as we want to be these new people who are independent and doing things more for ourselves, what you're used to just keeps creeping back in. And then there's the guilt around it. And I, for one, feel a lot of it, and in it, it's draining. It's so draining. So it's just taking those little steps, isn't it, to try different things.
It is, and the people around you aren't gonna let you say no, right? They're gonna push back because they've had all this time when you've done everything for them. So they're gonna be, "Oh, come on, mum, you always do that for me," and it's just being able to sit with them, getting on, sometimes it's uncomfortable because as women, we try and take on everybody else's stress and emotion. If someone's upset, we feel bad because they're upset, and we take that on and we kind of try and absorb it for them. But it's about letting them manage it. Sometimes we do our kids particularly a disservice in trying to take this away from them because they're not learning to be resilient and manage and problem solve on their own because we just take it all. But it's also really bad for us because we're, absorbing and internalizing all this distress that isn't ours to deal with. So 1000% could not agree more.
And I think because children are staying at home a lot longer than, say, our generation did, we we don't have that opportunity to actually move into that new stage of life of, it's just you and your partner or you living on your own. You've still got children with you, maybe up until the age of, that you're 60 years of age. Whereas I think about my parents, they were already on their own for nearly 20 years. So, yeah, so again, that's why it's so important, isn't it, to make that shift and for your bloody family to get on board.
Great. Yeah, and you just gotta stop enabling it. You've gotta, and it's gonna feel icky. We don't like to disappoint people. We've been raised to, be people pleasers. But, if you've gotta disappoint someone in your life, don't make it yourself, put things in place so that someone else has to deal with it, not yourself.
Absolutely. Oh,
Mm.
well, Leanne, I've really enjoyed this conversation. We've only scratched the surface, but for
Right.
women out there who might be thinking, yes, it sounds like me, I'd like to get some help. I mean, is there anywhere that they can go to learn more about it? Or, obviously, I will leave your details in the show notes if they want to reach out to you. But yeah, what's a good starting point? Because obviously, it's a really big thing for you to actually accept that you want to go down this road to find out. So, what's a great way for them to start?
I think checking in with thinking about your childhood, because as I said, one of the hardest parts is getting the evidence or finding out about whether these things that you're struggling with were present when you were 12 or younger.
Mm,
So have a think about that. If you've got access to old school reports, they're an amazing resource in being able to, and it's not going to be glaringly obvious because generally as a girl, you would have had an inattentive ADHD, which takes longer to diagnose and is less obvious, and we're amazing maskers. So it's not going to be written in there as a comment, but there'll be things like, as I said, has potential, but it's not living up to it, is zoning out, is the chatterbox, things like that that
yeah,
might indicate signs of ADHD. Talk to your family, talk to, is there any stories about you doing certain things, getting a better understanding of yourself growing up. I think also there's a really great resource that I use and recommend a lot called Attitude. So ADD Itude.
okay,
It's like a magazine, but it's got some phenomenal resources, webinars, articles about ADHD and a lot for ADHD in women. It's an American website, but it's an excellent resource.
okay, great,
Um, Obviously, there's me, Affinity Psychology. So we've got some information on our website. And also, if you are looking at medication, it would be checking in with psychiatrists. There's also lots of podcasts that are around now that are specific for ADHD women. So yeah, there are. It's getting easier. It's getting better.
yeah.
Awareness is increasing, thankfully. And I know a lot of people think, oh, it's a phenomenon and it's not real and it's just trendy. But for a lot of people, it's a really debilitating challenge. And I think that it's not increasing. Our prevalence rates still aren't the same as men. So women aren't being diagnosed the same as men, even now.
That's interesting.
Um, yeah, it's because men and boys tend to have that externalizing kind of outward, the hyperactive inattentive type rather than the hyperactive impulsive type,
Hmm.
not the inattentive type. So that's much clearer to see and much easier because most people have the idea of ADHD being, that boy swinging from the
Bouncing off
chandelier, right?
walls. Yeah.
That behavior disruption. So that's a lot easier to diagnose and see. And a lot of people, and it's disruptive, right? So teachers are going to call it out. Whereas girls with ADHD are sitting up the back, trying their hardest not to show any signs of being inattentive. So that takes longer. So getting familiar with what the symptoms are, getting familiar with what ADHD in women looks like. That's a massive thing because, as I said, even in our diagnostic criteria, there's not even any information. It goes on for pages and pages and pages how to diagnose it and what the criteria is. There isn't even a word about how this presentation is going to look different in females.
Right.
So yeah, that needs to change too.
Yes.
But yeah, I know. Can you believe it? Not a word of how nuanced it has to be in terms of women masking. So this stuff isn't going to be obvious that's in the criteria because women are going to be masking it. So that's the other thing is making sure you see somebody who is informed in how to work with women and girls. Because
Mm.
if you go the general run of the mill, they might not understand how this presentation looks different in women. One of the criteria is, do you often get up out of your seat? If you've got that hyperactive type, and women and girls aren't going to do that. We're people pleasers. We're not just going to jump up and walk around. So, I kind of nuance that to more like, do you often feel like you would like to get up and move around? Or do you often make excuses to go to the bathroom so you can move around or find ways to move? Which is just, it's only a small difference, but that's going to be much more likely to show up in women and girls than just jumping out of your seat.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so interesting. I think if you are feeling that way, why not? Why not just go down that road and work it out? It might be a life-changing diagnosis for you that it's like a weight's been lifted. And especially this friend of mine, she said it's like a weight has been lifted. And I now start to understand my brain.
If you spend years and decades blaming yourself because you can't fit in or you
Mm.
should, my least favorite word in the English language, you should be able to do this and you can't because other people can. If you don't understand that it's because you've got a different brain type, you've got a whole different operating system than everyone else, you shouldn't be comparing yourself with them. If you don't understand that and you internalize it as being a fundamental flaw in you or your personality, my God, that's so invalidating to spend your whole life thinking that about yourself. Yeah, so to get the diagnosis, I mean, unfortunately too late, but, to get that and to be able to have some understanding of why and it not being a problem with you not trying hard enough or caring enough, it's because you've got this whole different operating system.
Leanne, thank you so much. It's been a really interesting subject and topic to discuss. Now, I love to end all my episodes with the same question. I love a quote. I think quotes can really stop you in your tracks sometimes. And for me, sometimes it's what I need to snap me out of my mood or get me through the day. And I love to ask my guests, why don't you share a quote that you love? Because the more I have, the more I love to actually, I keep them in my phone. So is there one that you'd like to share with us?
I had one and then I spoke to my girlfriend last night and she's added another one. So, I'll be they're little ones though, so they'll be quick. The first one is, get curious, not furious. So that's something that I say to women that I work with all the time, but also parents in terms of if something's going on, get curious about what it is. Instead of thinking, I should be able to do this and getting angry, or my kids should be able to do this, get curious about what's underlying it. Often we have, anger is like a secondary emotion. What's really underlying that? Often it's fear or something else. So
Yeah.
get curious about what's happening for you now. Don't just accept it. Don't just get angry that you can't cope anymore, particularly in midlife. Get curious about what's underlying that and what's really going on. And the second one, my girlfriend rang me and she actually had this in a dream. It came to her in a dream.
Wow.
Um, I know. Must be real. It was because we're both very similar, kind of midlife age, and looking into how to make the next stage amazing. and it was, "Excuse me, I'm not done yet." Um,
That's a
I
good
like
one.
love that, isn't it? I like to think of it as, someone taking your plate away in the restaurant. You're like, "Excuse me, I'm not done yet." But in terms of life and how much more she has to give and how much more
Yeah.
she has to do and live and enjoy. So I'm not as polite as her, so I probably wouldn't say the "excuse me" part. I'd just say, "I'm not done yet." But, I really liked that one. I thought that one was quite pertinent to this
Yeah,
day.
absolutely. Love them. Thank you. I will
Pleasure.
put those out there because, like I said, I love quotes. I think they just
Uh,
they stop you in your tracks sometimes. You go, oh, I really needed to hear that today. So
agree. They hard sometimes, don't they?
yeah. Well, thank
Mm.
you so much. I'll leave your details in the show notes if anyone is interested in reaching out because, like I said, I think it's worthwhile exploring because it could actually be the thing that you need to change the way you're feeling at the moment. You need some validation for why you've been feeling like this for a long time. So, yeah, and I just think the more information we have, the better. Instead of sitting
100%.
in silence. Let's not do that anymore.
Yeah, sitting in silence makes you small. Get out there, figure out what's going on. Let's make us all bigger. We can take up space.
Absolutely. Thanks, Leanne.
Thanks, Michelle. Absolute pleasure.
Thanks for tuning in to another episode of Your Second Act. If you enjoyed this episode, I'd love it if you could rate and leave a review on your favorite podcast platform. Your feedback means the world to me.